Amen. In our last presentation, we read from the Great Controversy, page 392. It's chapter 22, and it was dealing with the disappointment in the Millerite history. Speaking about this disappointment here. We know that there was a great disappointment 6 months later, but it's this one that we were referring to, which many people are not aware of. In this period of tarrying, God's people went back and they realized that part of the prophecy that they were holding on to from the book of Habakkuk, which was to take the vision and make it plain upon tables, that they'd missed some information from here. And what they'd missed was a tarrying time. When the prophecy had apparently failed, Christ hadn't returned on April the 19th, 1844, they went back and began to review the material. Is it echoing? I can hear an echo. And if someone can make an adjustment. So there was this review period that was initiated, and another passage that they had used was Ezekiel chapter 12, and here they began to see that this tarrying time was a part of the prophecies. They still didn't notice that in Habakkuk chapter 2 it says plain upon tables in the plural, and they only had one table, they only had one chart. It's only later where God's people begin to realize that there are two charts, or these two tables. So the 1843 and the 1850 chart are a fulfillment of Habakkuk chapter 2. So if we turn to Habakkuk chapter 2, we're going to read from that passage, but before we do that, I just want to read a couple of Spirit of Prophecy quotes. Remember, I said that these prophets are really speaking about their own history. Whether it's Daniel, Habakkuk, Ezekiel, they're all really referring at the primary level to their own histories. When we consider that, testing, okay? Testing. 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 Yeah, we have 2 bars, so it should be okay. We saw that the prophets are primarily dealing with the history that confronts them in the present, but there's also an application to be made at the end of the world. Ellen White, in a number of different places, she focuses and says that, in fact, these prophets were really writing to our generation, referring back forward to our history, not their own. The Bible also mentions this. It says, these things were written for our admonition, for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the world have come. But I'm saying that when you have instruction that's going to be fulfilled in our history at the end of the world, it's an application of what happened in the original. If you remember, we mentioned earlier in the week Galatians chapter 4, and we saw that Galatians chapter 4 was the fulfillment of what passage? Isaiah chapter 54, I believe. In Isaiah chapter 54, the application has some differences to how Paul uses it in the book of Galatians in the New Testament. In the New Testament, he talks about these two different groups, Hagar and Sarah. But in Isaiah, you don't see the imagery of Hagar coming through. It's a story about Sarah and her progression of how she doesn't have a child, and then she has a child, and then she has many children. But the story in Isaiah is taken from where? From the book of Genesis. It's taken from the original story. So I want us to see that this principle or concept of application is well founded. I want to read from Prophets and Kings, page 554, paragraph 1. PK 554.1. This is going to confirm what I said earlier. Remember, I said that Daniel chapter 8, it's a few years to go before the 70-year captivity is going to end. Daniel's been given this vision, and it seems to be in contradiction to the desolation that they're experiencing, which he thought was going to be for 70 years. He checks that in chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the first year of Darius. He confirms that it's 70 years, and he knows he's in the 68th year, because he can calculate. 2 years on, he's expecting God's people to be released, the end of the 70-year captivity, but he doesn't understand about the 2300 days. That's why he's going back. He believes it's a conditional prophecy, and therefore he's repenting on behalf of his people so that God will fulfill his original word. And then Gabriel's going to come and give him further instruction and show him that there's two applications: a literal one in the present generation and a prophetic or symbolic one in the future. That's what that 2300 day prophecy is all about. So we're going to see that there's a relationship between 70 and 2300 days. We've got the 70-year captivity here, and we've got the 2300 day captivity, the 2300 year captivity here, or this punishment that's going to come upon God's people. But the 2300 days is connected to the 1260. We made all of those links earlier on. 554 paragraph 1. Through another vision, further light was thrown upon the events of the future. So this other vision is the vision of Daniel chapter 8. Previous paragraph, maybe I should read that. This is 553 paragraph 2. Shortly before the fall of Babylon, when Daniel was meditating on these prophecies and seeking God for an understanding of the times, a series of visions was given him concerning the rise and fall of kingdoms. With the first vision is recorded in the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. An interpretation was given, yet not all was made clear to the prophet. My cogitations much troubled me, he wrote, of his experience at the time, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. So it says the first vision is Daniel chapter 7. It's the first of a series of visions dealing with the specific subject. It says, shortly before the fall of Babylon, Daniel was meditating upon the prophecies. So he's meditating on some prophecies that are dealing with what? The fall of Babylon. So there are prophecies that discuss the fall of Babylon. He was meditating upon them to seek a clearer understanding of the times. The times is when those 70 years, well, that 70-year period is going to come to an end, or when Babylon's going to fall. And he's given a series of visions concerning the rise and fall of kingdoms. With the first vision, so if this is the first vision, you know she's not referring to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is not this series of visions that's being discussed. So these prophecies that are dealing with the fall of Babylon, it excludes Daniel chapter 2. If it excludes Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel chapter 7 is the first vision, where must he be looking? He must be looking at previous information. We agree with that? He must have been looking at previous records, and there aren't that many records for him to check. He's going to go to two primary sources. What would be the two primary sources he'd go to? He'd go to the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, and Daniel 9 tells us, he also goes where? To the book of Jeremiah. There are his two main sources. And in those sources he's going to see prophecies that relate to the fall of Babylon. Not the only places, but they're the major ones. At the end of the chapter, we all know that not everything is made clear. Now we're in 554 paragraph 1. Through another vision, further light was thrown upon the events of the future, and it was at the close of this vision that Daniel heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision? Now normally in a class, we would have gone into Daniel chapter 8 and spent a lot of time looking at the information. So the first question I want to ask is, when does the vision of Daniel chapter 8 finish? What verse? The 2300 day verse, when does it finish? 2300 day prophecy, when does it finish? So my sister already said, most people believe that it finishes either in verse 13 or verse 14. But it doesn't. It finishes in verse 12. So the 2300 day prophecy finishes in verse 12. It's important for us to understand, because people have a lot of misunderstanding about the 2300 days. Even though you might think it's a straightforward prophecy, it really is not that straightforward. She's going to, I don't know if you picked it up, but I'll reread the sentence to you. She confirms it here. Another vision, she's in Daniel chapter 8, light was thrown upon the events of the future, and it was at the close of this vision, when the vision closes, that Daniel heard one saint speaking and another saint speaking. So once the vision closes, then he hears. With that vision, he sees everything. Sees the ram, sees the goat. Once he stops seeing, now he starts hearing. So there are two separate things going on. You could say two separate visions going on. The answer that was given unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, filled him with perplexity. We've discussed what his perplexity is. What is his perplexity? He's expected the sanctuary to be cleansed when? At the end of 70 years, not at the end of 2,300 years. When we have the word cleansed, because we're understanding that it's the Day of Atonement, that's how the translators understood chapter 8, because it's dealing with the sanctuary service. So that's why they chose the word cleansed. But really, an alternative word, which is in many ways better, is actually restored. If you go back to the original, it means restored. You can use either word, but when it says the temple was going to be restored, remember that temple had been destroyed. Yes? They weren't going to go back to Jerusalem and clean that temple up. They have to rebuild it. They don't have to clean it, they have to rebuild. So God is going to use this language of the restoration of the temple, but He's going to superimpose upon that a symbolic application of the Day of Atonement, of the cleansing of the sanctuary. So all of this fills him with perplexity, with confusion. Earnestly he sought for the meaning of the vision. Why does he not understand the meaning of the vision? Because he understood that the desolation is going to be delivered by what nation? Babylon. Everyone understands that. I don't mean everyone us. I mean everyone them. They all understood that the people that are going to punish are Babylon. But now who does it introduce? It introduces Greece, and it introduces the little horn. When I ask you a question, why does it not identify who the little horn is? Verse 9 talks about a little horn that waxes great towards the east, the south, and the pleasant land. Why is he not told who that little horn is? Because if you go to verses, I think 20 and 21, it tells you who the ram is, and it tells you who the goat is. You don't have to guess. Why does it not tell you who the little horn is? The reason is because the little horn doesn't exist. When Daniel is given this information, the Medes and Persians are a nation that everyone's heard of. They all know about it. It's not some nation that's going to rise up in the future. They all know about the Medes and Persians. They also know about what other nation? Greece. They've heard about it. It's a backwater country, not famous for particularly much, but it's a nation that everybody's heard of. But this little horn power, Italy, no one's heard of Italy. You know, it's some random two-place country over there that no one talks about. So Rome is not a nation at that moment in history. I'm not saying people don't live in Italy, of course they do, but it's not a nation. And if he had said Rome, nobody would have understood who they're talking about. I don't think even the city was probably even called Rome at that time. So there's no way of identifying that nation. Now we can make a prophetic or symbolic application of that. We could say, for instance, that God was trying to hide that information from whom? From the Romans, so that they wouldn't destroy all the Bibles. Because nobody wants to hear that their nation's going to be destroyed, which is what this chapter teaches, essentially. They wouldn't want to know that, so they would have had a witch hunt against all the Bibles. They would have clamped down on the Jewish religion. People have that argument, and it's a valid argument. But what I want us to see, that common sense would teach us that God can't say Rome is going to come up, because Rome isn't a nation that anybody is familiar with. So it wouldn't make any sense. So he's going to try and understand what the vision means. He could not understand the relation, this is what we said, he could not understand the relation sustained by the 70 years captivity, as foretold through Jeremiah, to the 2300 years that in vision he heard the heavenly visitant declare should elapse before the cleansing of God's sanctuary. Is that exactly what we said in our presentation before? Yeah? It's virtually word for word. So I only give us the passage because I wanted us to see that you can construct that logic by approaching this story just with common sense. But it's not man-made wisdom. Ellen White confirms that, so that's why I read the passage, because if I said that, people will say, well, how do you know there's this relationship between the two? It's not something I've made up, but I wanted us to see that you can work it out. That's what I wanted us to show us. So I'll read it again. He couldn't understand the relationship between 70 and 2,300 years. What I want us to see is when you've got the 70 here, and you come to the end of the 70, and then you have these 3 decrees. What are the 3 decrees? What are they decreeing? The rebuilding of the temple. This is the cleansing of the sanctuary, the restoration of the sanctuary. So it's all language that, when you understand the literal application, all makes sense. it takes 3 commandments, 3 laws to construct or create this temple. I don't know if you read or took note when we read from Ezra chapter 6 verses 14 and 15. It said that the temple was complete under what decree? Under the second. So it's completed under the second. Why do you need a third? Why do you need a third decree if it's all done by the second? The answer is simple. If you go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 13, the treading down or the desolation, this desolation here or this desolation here, what's being trodden down? It's not just the sanctuary, it's also the people, the host, yes? So the host and the sanctuary. I'll put H for host, S for sanctuary. Host is a symbol of what? Or what is a host? It's a symbol of an army, but I'm going to just say this is people. So people and temple. Are we okay with that? What verse was that? 8:13. Let's go to 9. The reason why we're doing this, for those of us who are here for the whole of the week, I want to show us how we build up line upon line, how this principle works. Verse 26. This is the preamble, this is not the part that I want us to focus on. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. You can see, if you're reading King James, there's a colon there. Yes? It's a break in thought. This is the bit I want us to read. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood until the end of the war. Desolations are determined. What are they going to come and destroy? The city and the sanctuary. This is 9:26. What does 8:13 say? The host and the sanctuary. So you can see that the host and the sanctuary in 8:13 is exactly the same history or idea as 9:26. It doesn't say people, it says city and sanctuary. I'm going to change that to temple. It says sanctuary in both verses. So if I were to ask you, what is a city? It's a symbol of people. It's equal. What city is this? Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a symbol of people. We know what people it is. It's God's people. God's people in the scriptures are symbolized as what? As an army. I'll put army in parentheses. So, coming back to the passage that we're looking at, he couldn't understand the relationship between the 70 and the 2300 days. Here's a 70 and here's a 2300 day. Do they line up? They don't, because the 70 ends here at the time of the end, and 2300 days, I'll do it simply. The 70 ends at number 1, and the 2300 days ends at number 3. But here, the 70 years when it ends at number 1, this is the first decree. The first decree for what? The rebuilding of the temple. So there's this concept of temple that we need to understand. Yeah? So, I'll put temple here. The 2300 days, here you're at the third decree. The third message. What's going to happen here at this third message? We know that there's these 46 years. We could go to John chapter 2 verse 20 and we know how long did it take to build the temple? 46 years. So there's this 46 years. So here we've got the temple. which is the star. I'll call it the Alpha, and this is the temple, the Omega. So why not associate the 70 with this event? Why does it want to go to this event? What is the Lord trying to show us, to indicate to us? Because in Daniel 8:13, it doesn't just talk about the sanctuary, does it? It talks about the host. So you've got the sanctuary or the temple and the host. Let me ask you a question. We're in Daniel chapter 8. When does the vision begin? Verse. I would say verse 3. When does it end? Verse 12. And then we have 13 and 14. When does verse 14 end? What year? 1844. Verse 13 says what? How long shall be the vision? Which vision? This one here. This vision. Verse 13 says, how long is this vision? This one here. The answer is 2,300 days. Agree with that? The vision begins here and it ends here. What year does verse 12 end in? So we've got two different answers. We've got 1844 and someone says 1798. Let's read verse 12. We're in Daniel chapter 8 verse 12. I have to fill in some information because if you're not familiar with these passages, you won't know what the symbols are. So I'll add some information in just to help you with the symbols. But that's not going to change the point that we want to make, that we'll all see clearly. I'll read the verse first. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Throughout this verse you can see, and now I'll pick it up, a host was given him. And you've read in the King James, the him is italicized. Okay, so we've got the word him. Something is given to him. And this thing that's given to him is to make war or be against the daily by reason of transgression. It says, it cast down the truth to the ground, it practiced and prospered. So there's an it, two its. All this is the same person. Who is this person? The him and the it. When it says, a host was given him, this host is an army. This army is owned by a government. So a government or a state army is going to be given to him. And the reason it's given is to fight against the daily. And if you check what the daily in this context is paganism. So an army is going to be given to this entity to make war or to fight against paganism. And when this army comes and joins hands with him, this is in transgression of God's law. It says in transgression. And it, the same thing, cast the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. The way this entity cast the truth to the ground is through the aid and the help of this army and some other components. So hold on to that thought. Go to the previous chapter 7, verse 25. Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until the times and dividing of time. So I'm saying verse 25, chapter 7, is the same as Daniel 8, verse 12. Same entity. Who's the he in 725? It's the little horn, it's the papacy. The little horn is going to speak great words against God, and he's going to do what? Kill or destroy God's people. Chapter 8, verse 12, there's this army that's going to be given. The army's going to do two things. First of all, it's going to destroy paganism, and the second thing is it's going to persecute God's people. And this papal power, this him, is going to cast the truth to the ground. So, in verse 12, this is the papacy. And this is the little horn. It's Rome, papal Rome. It says it's going to do all this activity for as long as it practices and prospers. How long does the papacy practice and prosper for? 1260 years. When does he stop prospering? 1798. When does the vision end? 1798 here. It ends in 1798, and then you get this conversation, and now it's going to go to 1844. So there's a disconnect between the vision from verses 3 to verse 12 and the question and answer in verses 13 and 14. This practicing and prospering is brought to view in Daniel 7:25. In 7:25, what's one of the activities that he does? He tramples down or wears out the saints. So what I want us to see is here, when we come to the 2300-day prophecy, it's dealing with what subject? It's dealing with the sanctuary. When you're dealing with the 70 years, what are you dealing with? It's not the sanctuary, but it's what? It's the host. Because the host have been trodden down underfoot, haven't they? For how many years? 70 years. When does it stop? Here, the time of the end. This is the host, even though it's dealing with the temple. Because there are two concepts that need to be put together. The host and the temple. That's Daniel 8:13. One of them is marking the host here, and one of them is marking the sanctuary here. This is in agreement with Daniel chapter 8, because the vision ends where? Here or here? It ends here in 1798, once the papacy stops prospering. There's this 46-year black hole in the vision, which we need to understand. So all I'm going to say about this, because I'm done with what I want to say, is when we think about the 2300-day prophecy, most Adventists think it's relatively straightforward, and it's not. It's much more comprehensive. It's much more difficult than people realize. And the reason for that is because they don't understand the relationship between the host and the sanctuary. There are two things to consider: the host and the sanctuary. Let's come back to our passage. 70 years ends here. Time of the end. 2300 days ends here. So the 70 ends on the 1st, and the 2300 days ends on the 3rd. So there's this relationship between the 1st and the 3rd decree. The 1st angel's message and the 3rd angel's message. If you don't understand how to put history upon a line, if you don't know your history, all of this information is obscure to you, and you can't dig out these truths. He couldn't understand the relationship between the 70 years and the 2300 days. That in vision he heard the heavenly visitant declare should elapse before the cleansing of God's sanctuary. Before I finish the passage, one more point. What's the relationship between the 1260 and the 2300 days? I've already given you the answer to it. What's the 1260 about? The host. 1260 is about the host, remember? The 2300 days is about the temple, the sanctuary. So now you can begin to see the relationship between the 1260 and the 2300 days. Which prophecy is the most important? The one that you're given 7 times. The 1260 is given 7 times in Scripture. God wants to tell you something about what? The host. All of this is hidden. It's all coded. It's not brought to view. The beginning of Adventism, the focus is on what? The sanctuary, the temple. The end of the world, our focus needs to be on the host. Why? Because what is the host meant to be? What are we meant to be? Temples of God, are we not? Are we not the temple of God? Not just corporately, but individually. So you can begin to see why the focus at the end of the world is not about some structure. It's not about a building in the United States. It's not even about the sanctuary in heaven. It's the sanctuary that is what? What is this sanctuary? It's a human body. That's what God is trying to teach us through the 2300-day prophecy. And people just don't get it. The angel Gabriel gave him a partial interpretation, yet when the prophet heard the words, "The vision shall be for many days," he fainted away. I, Daniel, fainted, he records of his experience, and was sick certain days. Afterwards I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. No one understands a 2300-day prophecy. Let me tell you, if no one understands it here, in this history, we're in this history here, that's where Daniel is, in the captivity, do you think we're going to understand it here at the end of the world? We don't understand the prophecy either. And that's what our problem is. This church, our church, God's church, the Seventh-day Adventist church, does not understand the 2300-day prophecy, period. We think we do because we've got a surface understanding of this. And because we don't understand the 2300-day prophecy, we don't understand what Habakkuk and Ezekiel are trying to teach us when they point forward to this history here, and there's an application of the 2300 days. Because we don't even understand that the vision of verses 3 to 12 actually ends in 1798. Let me ask you another question. We read Daniel chapter 9 verse 26. It's over here, remember? Daniel 9:26. When does Daniel 9:26 end? When does that prophecy end? What year? Good. People have studied, or people know, or people have worked it out, because most people will tell you it ends when? In AD 34. Because it's 70 weeks, isn't it? 70-week prophecy ends in AD 34. But if you check carefully, the story doesn't end there. It ends when? 1798. So Daniel chapter 9 ends in 1798. Daniel chapter 8 ends in 1798. And here we've got 1844. We need to understand the relationship between these two dates. And God's people are clueless about the relationship of 1798 to 1844. Even though it's been plainly stated. It's 46 years, and it takes 46 years to rebuild a temple. That's what the relationship between the two is. But it's not just that. It's also dealing with the host and the sanctuary, the host and the temple. I want to read another passage to you. Prophets and Kings, page 714, paragraph 1. Today the Church of God is free to carry forward to completion the divine work for the salvation of a lost race. For many centuries, God's people suffered a restriction of their liberty. The preaching of, I'm going to read it all, then I'm going to comment. The preaching of the gospel in its purity was prohibited, and the severest of penalties were visited upon those who dared disobey the mandates of men. As a consequence, the Lord's great moral vineyard was almost wholly unoccupied. The people were deprived of the light of God's word. The darkness of error and superstition threatened to blot out a knowledge of true religion. God's church on earth was as verily in captivity during this long period of relentless persecution as were the children of Israel held captive in Babylon during the period of their exile. We'll work backwards. The last portion. It says God's church on earth was in captivity during this long period of relentless persecution. When is this long period of relentless persecution? It says the darkness of error and superstition. What is that period? Is it 1260? Sister Katenda, remember in her presentations, has been speaking about the period of darkness that precedes the reform line. This period of darkness is the Dark Ages. It's the darkness that Ellen White's speaking about here. It's the 1260. She says God's people were in captivity. Who are they in captivity to? To Babylon. Mystery Babylon. Revelation 17 verse 5. This is the papal church. It says they were held in captivity during the long period, as were. That means in the same way. That means parable. That means parallel concept. The children of Israel held captive in Babylon during the period of the exile, which is the 70 years. So she's now done what? Compared the 70 to the 1260. What happened in Daniel chapter 8? The 70 to the 2300 days. In Daniel chapter 8, it's the 70 with the 23. In Prophets and Kings, Ellen White says it's the 70 with the 1260. Hopefully we can understand that. Let me ask you a question. The next passage says, but thank God, his church is no longer in bondage. To spiritual Israel have been restored the privilege accorded the people of God at the time of their deliverance from Babylon. In every part of the earth, men and women are responding to the heaven-sent message which John the Revelator prophesied would be proclaimed prior to the second coming of Christ. Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. She quotes Revelation 14 verse 7, the first angel's message. No longer have the host of evil power to keep the church captive, for Babylon is fallen, that great city which has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. To spiritual Israel is given a message. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive And to spiritual Israel is given a message. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. As the captive exiles heeded the message, flee out of the midst of Babylon, and were restored to the land of promise, so those who fear God today are heeding the message to withdraw from spiritual Babylon, and soon they are to stand as trophies of divine grace in the earth made new, and which is the heavenly Canaan. I want to ask you, and for those of us who weren't in the study earlier, we may not know the answer. From 1850, what happens to our church? We go into evil. Even though Ellen White's giving this rosy picture that we are not, she says, but thank God his church is no longer in bondage. What happens after the death of Ellen White? God's church, in a really serious way, goes into bondage. In fact, the bondage actually begins before. This evil here, that begins in 1850, we never recover from. And it goes from bad to worse. In how many generations? 4 generations. We can mark the 4 generations: 1863, 1888, 1919, and 1957. We can mark 4 specific events. We can mark 4 generations. Unfortunately, God's people went into bondage And if you're going to bondage, who do you go into bondage to? The only place you're going to go into bondage to is Babylon. Because Babylon are the people that punish you. Why does Babylon punish you? Because you broke the covenant. God went into the covenant with God's people here, October 22nd, 1844. It continues 2 years later in 1846, and by 1850, everything's sorted out. God's about ready to take his people home. Here was to begin the loud cry of the third angel's message, the message to the world. But God's people failed to do that, and they begin to warp and distort the third angel's message. Ellen White tells us that God begins to try to correct this message in 1888. God's people do what? Reject it. They become Korah, Dathan and Abiram. Total disregard of what the message is that God wants us to understand. By 1919, the Bible conference, 4 years after Ellen White's death, the end is here. The church now is going to separate prophecy from the gospel. They're going to be two separate things, where in fact they were supposed to be the same. By the 1930s, the church has totally destroyed our message. We have no message. By 1957, we've totally destroyed the sanctuary message. We'd already destroyed prophecy a few years before. Now we destroyed the sanctuary message. And now we're in this history. We're in bondage all of this time. When do you come out of bondage? When do you come out of bondage? The time of the end. When do you come out of bondage? At the time of the end. In our history, you're going to come out of bondage the time of the end. We could have had a time of the end in Ellen White's day, but we didn't. So now we have an end of time in our history. So I want us to see that God's people have been in bondage. We've now been released from that bondage, and we're free to prosecute the work that God wants us to do. Now let's go to Habakkuk chapter 2. What we want to start to discuss is, what is this vision here? What is this vision in Habakkuk? Hopefully you'll remember where we identified the placement of these prophets. Habakkuk chapter 2. And I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. What is verse 1 saying? Verse 1 is saying that who's I? Habakkuk. Habakkuk is going to stand upon his watch, which makes him a watchman. What are watchmen required to do? Watch for what? Watch for the enemy. You're going to watch for the enemy coming. I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, the watchtower. What is the tower a symbol of? Church. In this context, it says the tower is a fenced place. So you've got this fenced place, and there's some structure in here. So here's this fenced place, and he's going to set himself here amidst this fenced place, or this defended place. And will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. What does it mean to be reproved? When I'm told off. When God's going to tell me off and argue with me, let's see what's going to happen, what we're going to say. Now, hold on to all of that thought, the imagery that we've just developed there. The Lord answered me and said, what does it mean the Lord answered me and said? What's this in connection to? Verse 1, when I am reproved. So this is the reproof. Yeah? He says, when God's going to reprove me, when God's going to argue with me, we want to know what the argument is, don't we? And it's here in verse 2. This is the argument. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. So here's Habakkuk. Who's he arguing with? He's arguing with God. And what's God going to do? He's going to tell him off. He's going to argue back. Yes? So we've got this watchman arguing with God, and God's going to argue back. And what's God's argument? He says, write the vision, make it plain. So why? Simply, so that everyone can... I'm going to say that everyone can understand it. That's what it means to make it plain. To make it so plain. So what's to be made plain to the people? Here's this watchman. What's the purpose of a watchman? To watch for what? To watch for the enemy. These people are doing what? Arguing with God. If you're a watchman and you're arguing with God and you're supposed to watch out for the enemy, so here I am, I tell my brother, get to the top of this building and do what? Watch for enemy. And he starts arguing with me. Why would he be arguing? He says, I don't want to do this job. Why would he not want to do the job? Because he believes we're living in a time period of peace and safety, and it's a waste of time to get onto the top of the tower and look for the enemy. Why? Because the enemy is not going to come. Yes? Hold on to that thought. Remember this history here. This is the last 7 kings of Judah. That's why we developed from Manasseh to Zedekiah, because this lot, the 10 tribes, had been destroyed. Tomorrow, if you come tomorrow, we're going to do a study in Isaiah 28. It's a really good study, so please all try and come. Keep your hands in Habakkuk. Let's go to Isaiah 28. All the prophets speak about the same thing, don't they? What's Isaiah going to be talking about? The same thing that Habakkuk's talking about, the same thing that Zephaniah's talking about. Agree with that? Okay, so these people here in Habakkuk, here's Habakkuk. How many tribes have you got left? 2 tribes, all these are destroyed. So when Habakkuk's doing his ministry, who's he ministering to? Only the 2 tribes. Where are they located? Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. This is Judea, not Samaria. And we agree with that. Okay, we read in Habakkuk that there's an argument. God tells you to be a watchman in this fenced place, and these people are arguing. Why would they argue with him? Because they think nothing's going to happen to them. There's no armies, there's no opponents that are going to come and destroy them, so it's a waste of time. God says, look, get this information and make it plain so that everyone can see and understand. Do we understand what Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 1 and 2 are saying, the relationship between them? Does everybody understand that? Yeah? Why are they arguing? Because there's no enemy coming. So it's a wasted job. God says, put this information plainly so that they can all know what? That what's coming? That an enemy is coming. Make it plain to them that the enemy is coming, because they don't believe he's coming. Now my question is, why do they not believe the enemy is coming? The answer is going to be found in Isaiah 28, where we are now. We're going to read verse 14. Before we read it, where are we? In Jerusalem. Verse 14, wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. We're in the same place. These men are what? Scornful. So they're not good men. Whatever the word scornful means, they're not good men. And they're ruling the people. We're going to see what they do. Verse 15, because ye, who's ye? Not the people, who's ye? The leaders, the scornful men. Because ye men have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. These men are saying this. They've made a deal with death. Often the Bible is going to get a concept like death and they're going to turn it into a person. It's a parable. It's called personification. If I took a goat, what would I want to do with that goat? Turn it into a person, into a man, so I personify it. If the goat's got a horn on his head, the personification is who? Alexander the Great. If it's got 4 horns, the personification is what? The 4 generals. So the Bible talks about this concept of personification, turning objects or turning concepts into people. Can you make a deal with death? Of course you can't. Death is not a thing. Death is the absence of something, the absence of life. But God is going to turn this into a person. So they made this deal with death. And with hell, a weird agreement. By the way, that is a what? Repeat and enlarge. Repeat and enlarge. So they've made a covenant with death, and with hell are we in agreement. I hope you don't mind me getting on a detour, but this is a really nice example because this week we haven't done any of this. Most of all, what I mostly do now at prophecy schools is show people how to go through verses and study them carefully, and we haven't done that much this week, especially when it comes to the rules. But I have shown you repeat and enlarge, yes? Shown you how that works, but I haven't given you many examples. I've just shown you this is repeat and enlarge, but I also want to show you something else. It's a really important principle. I'm going to structure the verse this way. So can we see the repeat? Yes? And it's the enlargement. So I've got 4 words. Hopefully you're going to fill in the 4 words for me. And we're going to see repeat and enlarge. We're in verse 15. So what's the word we're going to put here? Covenant. The word here? Isn't this easy? Yeah, it's easy. Bible study is easy when you know the rules. What word goes here? We've got to let the Bible teach us. We're going to go in the sequence. The first word was covenant. The second word was the next word. Hell, isn't it? It's hell. Next word. So what we want to see here is a really beautiful rule, principle, observation, whatever you want to call it. Not just do we have a repeat and enlarge, but if I were to take death, what word does it connect with? Covenant, agreement. So what we've got here is a mirror, or what we call a chiasm. Can everybody see that? It's a really important principle. You can get chiasms in verses, you can get a chiasm in a chapter, you can get chiasm in a book. So it's this mirroring. It's called a chiasm, or a structure, a chiastic structure. So if I were to ask you, what does a covenant mean? It means agreement. It's a biblical definition. If you want to argue with people, which we shouldn't do, about hell, because the reason we shouldn't argue is because we don't do public evangelism, and we all know about the state of the dead. If you want to argue with someone, and they say there is hell and all of this stuff, it's a biblical proof. You can do it in about 30 seconds to show what hell is. You don't need to go to a dictionary. You don't need to go to Strong's Concordance. Biblical definition of the word hell is death. It's easy to see. Okay, so that's not what we went to this verse for, but I wanted to show you that. Verse 15. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hid ourselves. So this deal that they've made with death, a good deal or a bad deal? Bad deal, because it's based upon what? The truth or falsehood? Falsehood. It says, for we have made lies our refuge. The deal was when the overflowing scourge comes, what's going to happen? Death will not do what? Come and knock on our doors and come and get us. Death won't come and get us. And it says, for we have made lies our refuge. So we're going to hide behind these lies. We're going to hide behind these falsehoods. And what is a falsehood? That when the scourge comes, what's going to happen? That the death won't touch them. We agree with that? So, what's the truth that's going to happen? When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, what will happen to these people? It's going to what? It's going to kill them. Death is going to come to them. So death is lying to them. He says, yes, I'll make a deal with you. Peace and safety message, everything's going to be okay. But when the scourge comes, you're really going to die. It's all about lies. Adventists are liars. Because we think when the overflowing scourge is going to come, it's not going to touch us, because we made some deal, some covenant. We made a covenant with death, with hell, that when this overflowing scourge comes, we're going to be okay. And God says that is just a pack of lies. This overflowing scourge, what is it? Let's go to verse... let's go to verse 17. Judgment also will allay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. That's not what I want to address, but it's an important point. It's the next part. And the hail shall sweep away, what? Do you read about refuge of lies? Verse 15. Shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. So is verse 15 connected with verse 17? Of course it is. So we know that this overflowing scourge is what? The overflowing scourge of verse 15. So I've got verse 15, the overflowing scourge equals what? In verse 17. It equals the hail, did someone say? And the water. The clue, verse 17, is the overflow. Yeah, the overflowing scourge, the waters that overflow. So the overflowing scourge is the hail and the water. They're the same thing. We can see that. And it's going to sweep away this covenant, this deal. Yes or no? Are we okay with there? Let's go to verse 2. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. Now we've got verse 2. What is the overflowing scourge, the hail, the water? What is it? Beginning of the verse. Behold, the Lord hath... It's the mighty strong one. The tempest and all the information in the rest of the verse is just a repeat of this information. Sorry? Did someone say something? So what I want to say is that we're doing repeat and enlarge, and we're going to connect this one. How do we make the connection? Because it says in the verse, it's a hail, which is a destroying storm, and a flood of mighty waters, which is the hail and the waters here. So it says hail and water. So it's this imagery here that connects these two together. But we want to see that it's the mighty strong one. So what we want to find out is who the mighty strong one is. First of all, these people in Jerusalem are doing what? They're saying when it comes, it's not going to touch us. Let's go to verse 1. What I want to do... We're not going to go to verse 1. I'm just going to summarize because I want to do this in a bit more detail tomorrow. So what I want to say is this. We're in this history here. In Habakkuk. Yes? And in Habakkuk, they're saying we don't need to put men on the watchtower because there's not going to be any enemy coming. So the reason we went to 15, 17 and 2, because they're saying we have made this deal so that when the overflowing scourge shall come, who's the overflowing scourge? The mighty one. When the mighty one comes, what's he not going to do? He's not going to touch us. So if he's not going to touch us, what don't we need? We don't need watchmen on the watchtower. Let's come back to Habakkuk. We'll go into Isaiah 28 in a bit more detail tomorrow. Before we carry on, we'll stop our presentation and we'll have a short break because we've got one more presentation before lunch. Just want to summarize. The vision of Habakkuk and Ezekiel, I'm saying, are not the same vision that the Millerites use when they say it's the 2300 days. The reason we know that is because they're going to be talking about their own dispensation. And in their dispensation, the 2300 days hasn't started. It's more than 100 years. Much more than 100 years. Somewhere around 200 years when that 2300 days is even going to begin. 457 BC. That's our first argument. So we want to understand what the vision is. We know that the 10 tribes have been destroyed. We're in this history here, and Habakkuk is somewhere around between Ammon and Josiah. We saw that there's this argument between Habakkuk and whom? And God. God says, put a watchman on this tower. Why would you want to do that? Because the enemy's coming. And Habakkuk says, waste of time. There's no enemy coming. How do you know there's not an enemy coming? Because you made a deal with death. So when these enemy comes, he's not going to do what? He's not going to touch us. He's just going to go either side of this fenced city, and he's not going to give us any problems, so we don't need any watchmen. God says, because God's going to argue back at him and says, what you better do is what? Get this message and make it plain upon tables, so whoever wants to hear it, understand it, can do what? Can run. This is not a proper way of understanding this word run. It's not correct. I'm going to give you it though. You need to do what? You need to run away. It doesn't mean that in the verse, but it says when you hear, you better run. Where should you run from? Where are you? You're in Jerusalem. You better run from Jerusalem when you read this information on this table. Because if you stay, what's going to happen? you're going to be destroyed. Have you heard about people running away from Jerusalem when these watchmen are supposed to be looking out for these enemies coming? You heard a story about that before? Of course you have. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. This is the sign that God gives his disciples. So you know Habakkuk chapter 2 is connected with what? Matthew 24. This is the besieging of Jerusalem. Can we see how we can connect these thoughts together? Now that was naughty of me, because the word run here doesn't really mean to run away when you check it in context. But it's an English word that says run, and if we trust in the King James Version, then we can use the word run, and we can make an application of that history and say, yeah, you should run, you should flee from Jerusalem. Let's pray. That's a nice thought if you didn't really pick the implications of it. Heavenly Father, we want to give you praise and thanks for your goodness and mercy. Help us, Lord, to have a clearer understanding of your word, so that as we approach, study, we might have a transformation of our very nature, our very being, that we might be the people that you want us to be. Lord, as we hear this message, may we run according to your will, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.